Jupiter in the 8th house. Deep resource. Welcome to Jupiter in the 8th house in Synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Jupiter falls into another person's 8th house, the house of shared resource, intimacy, transformation, and the more hidden and intense undercurrents of a life. Death, inheritance, debt, and the psychological depths that lie beneath ordinary social presentation. This overlay does not move in the open, declarative register of the 7th house, nor the bright sociability of the 5th. Its territory is private, often unspoken, and considerably more intense than most of what has come before in this series. Where Jupiter in the 7th expands the formal and visible bond between two people, Jupiter in the 8th expands what happens beneath that bond, the merging of resources, the psychological exposure of real intimacy, and the transformative pressure that close, sustained closeness with another person inevitably applies. Jupiter's basic nature continues to govern the terms of this overlay, though the 8th house's particular intensity gives that nature a distinctive and somewhat more fraught expression than in most of the houses already covered. Jupiter operates through expansion, through increase, through a generosity that in lighter houses produces straightforward abundance. The 8th house is not a lighthouse. It is traditionally considered one of the more difficult places in the chart, associated with loss, crisis, and the kind of change that does not ask permission before arriving. Jupiter's expansiveness, applied to a house this serious, produces something genuinely worth examining carefully. Not the easy benefit gloss that popular astrology sometimes assumes, but a real and consequential interaction between abundance and intensity. The 8th house, in traditional astrology, governs shared resources, particularly money and property that come through others, such as inheritance, a partner's finances, or debt, alongside death, sex, and the deep psychological transformation that comes through genuine intimacy or crisis. Jupiter holds no dignity here, no domicile, no exaltation, no joy. And in fact, some traditional sources regard a benefix's placement in this house with a degree of caution, since the 8th house's natural concerns are not easily softened simply by a generous planet's presence. This is a house where Jupiter's optimism meets terrain that does not always reward optimism, and the overlay's honest treatment requires holding that tension rather than resolving it too quickly into reassurance. From the Jupiter person's perspective, there is often a genuine pull toward the house person's hidden depths, their intensity, their unspoken fears, the parts of themselves the house person does not show to casual acquaintances. The Jupiter person may find themselves drawn into precisely the kind of close, exposing intimacy that the 8th house represents, approaching that intimacy with characteristic confidence and a degree of fearlessness that the house person may not always share. There is often, too, a generosity around shared resource, a willingness, on the Jupiter person's part, to merge finances, to extend trust around debt or inheritance, to treat what is materially shared between two people as an opportunity rather than a risk. From the house person's perspective, the experience is often one of feeling met in territory most people avoid. The 8th house is where a person is at their most psychologically exposed, and Jupiter's presence there can make that exposure feel less frightening than it ordinarily does. There is room, under this overlay, to be genuinely known in one's depths, rather than only in one's presentable surfaces. The house person may also experience real material benefit through this overlay, particularly around inheritance, shared assets, or the resolution of debt, since Jupiter's expansive touch on the house of shared resource frequently coincides with some form of financial gain or relief connected to the relationship. At its most constructive, this overlay produces a relationship of genuine depth and transformative intimacy. The Jupiter person's fearlessness around exposure and vulnerability can help the house person access a level of psychological honesty they do not easily reach elsewhere, and the resulting intimacy tends to feel substantial rather than merely pleasant, earned through real disclosure rather than assumed through easy compatibility. Shared resources, where they are part of the relationship's structure, often benefit as well. Inheritance handled with unusual goodwill. Debt approached with optimism rather than anxiety. Joint finances treated as a domain of mutual benefit rather than mutual suspicion. Where genuine crisis or loss enters the relationship, as the eighth house's domain eventually ensures it will in some form, Jupiter's presence can offer real comfort and a faith that transformation, however painful, ultimately leads somewhere worth arriving. And yet the eighth house's particular intensity gives Jupiter's characteristic excess a shape that is considerably more consequential here than in lighter houses, where Jupiter's inflation in the fifth house distorts pleasure, and in the second house distorts material expectation. In the eighth house, it risks distorting one's relationship to genuine risk, producing a kind of misplaced confidence around debt, shared liability, or psychological exposure that the house's actual stakes do not support. Jupiter's optimism, applied to inheritance or joint finance, can tip into recklessness, an assumption that shared debt will simply resolve itself, that financial entanglement with another person carries less risk than it does, that the house's genuinely serious material stakes can be approached with the same breezy confidence Jupiter brings to lighter houses. There is also a pattern worth naming around psychological intensity itself. The eighth house does not merely invite intimacy, it can also represent crisis, obsession, and forms of attachment that exceed what is healthy. Jupiter's expansive touch, applied here, can amplify intensity in ways that are not always benign. A fascination with the house person's depths that tips into something more consuming, or a merging of identities that, taken too far, erodes rather than enriches both people's sense of independent selfhood. Jupiter does not naturally apply restraint to anything it touches, and the eighth house is one of the few houses in this series where the absence of restraint carries genuinely serious consequences rather than merely social or financial ones. A further risk concerns the handling of loss and crisis when they do arrive, as the eighth house's domain makes likely at some point in any sustained relationship. Jupiter's instinct is to reassure, to find the silver lining, to insist that things will work out. And while this can be genuinely comforting, it can also function as a way of avoiding the harder, more necessary work of actually grieving, actually processing, actually sitting with loss rather than expanding past it prematurely. A relationship that relies on Jupiter's optimism to skip over genuine crisis rather than move through it may find that what was avoided does not disappear, but simply resurfaces later, less easily managed than it would have been if met directly the first time. The distinction between this overlay's nourishing and inflating expressions tends to rest on whether its evident depth is matched by genuine care around risk. Jupiter expands the felt sense that intimacy and shared resource are safe. It does not, on its own, verify that they actually are. When the Jupiter person's fearlessness around exposure and shared resource is paired with honest assessment of actual risk, financial, psychological, and otherwise, this overlay produces a relationship of real transformative depth. When that assessment is absent, the same fearlessness can produce entanglement, financial or psychological, considerably more serious than either person accounted for at the outset. At its highest expression, Jupiter in the eighth house creates a relationship of genuine depth, intimacy that reaches past surface compatibility into real psychological honesty, shared resources handled with goodwill rather than suspicion, and a capacity to meet crisis when it comes, with faith that transformation leads somewhere survivable. The Jupiter person's fearlessness around exposure gives the house person room to be known beyond their presentable self. The house person, in turn, gives the Jupiter person's expansive instincts a context serious enough to make that expansion meaningful rather than merely careless. When balanced, Jupiter in the eighth house creates transformative intimacy, generous handling of shared resource, and a faith in the relationship's capacity to survive genuine crisis. When imbalanced, it can produce financial recklessness around debt and inheritance, an intensity that tips into consuming attachment, and an optimism that skips past necessary grief rather than moving through it. At its core, this overlay is about the experience of being known in one's depths rather than only one's surfaces, and of finding that depth met with faith rather than fear. The question it poses, and that only the two people involved can answer, is whether that faith is grounded in honest reckoning with what real intimacy and shared risk actually require, or whether it is, for now, simply the expansive and unexamined feeling that depth itself is automatically safe.
This was Jupiter in the 8th house in Synastry Overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Jupiter in the 9th house.